Welcome to today's presentation on reporting fraud from a case manager's standpoint. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity and voiced by Cheryl Goebel. In this training, we will focus on new procedures for reporting and submitting vital information for cases suspected of fraud. Here's a list of some commonly used terms and acronyms that will be addressed throughout the presentation. You should be familiar with these terms and acronyms by the end of the presentation. Let's define what we mean when we say fraud. For the purposes of this presentation, fraud is best defined as an act of deceiving or misleading something or someone to achieve an outcome of an undeserved gain. The part that particularly relates to WTP and SNAP work programs and the services we provide are located in the Florida Statutes 414.39, Section 1, A, B, and C. Altered documents can be considered misrepresentation or impersonation. Altering a document or forging a document to receive public assistance, including services under any state and federally funded programs, is considered fraud. Based on the Florida statute, failure to disclose a change in circumstances in order to obtain or continue to receive any such public assistance to which he or she is not entitled, or in a larger amount to which he or she is entitled, or aids and abets another person in the commission of any such act, is guilty of a crime and shall be punished under the provided subsection 5. DEO and DCF are both serious about discouraging fraud and fraud attempts. Customers applying and recertifying for public benefits are made aware that fraud and attempted fraud are prosecutable and could lead to disqualification of public assistance benefits. In addition to the public assistance fraud warning on DCF's website, DCF has provided the ability for citizens to report instances of fraud or suspected fraud. These options are available to anyone wishing to report fraudulent activity. The site offers two types of fraud reporting: formal and general. There is a formal complaint form found on the website. This process is not anonymous and requires detail. There is also a hyperlinked option to report food assistance and cash assistance and TANF welfare fraud, which are anonymous. Initiating a formal complaint on DCF's website is for reporting suspected fraud by DCF employees, including department and contracted providers. To initiate a formal complaint, the complainant will check on the Inspector General complaint form. It also provides general information about the Whistleblowers Act, which can be found in the Florida Statute 112.318-112.31895. To learn more about reporting formal complaints, please visit the DCF's website. DCF's general fraud reporting can be accessed by clicking on the applicable hyperlink. After selecting one of these options, the user will see the screen that has 4 steps. Elements such as name and city are required. Information such as name and phone number can be provided. However, this information is not required. Since it is an online form, a person can submit the report and no further action is required from the person making the report. DEO and DCF have teamed up to provide a formal way to report suspected incidents of fraud by customers participating in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and also the Welfare Transition Program. The process involves reporting suspected fraud directly into DCF's Florida system. Case managers are generally alerted to potential fraud when they are conducting progress follow-ups and employer satisfaction on customers who are assigned to various activities. They may also be alerted to potential fraud while verifying other documentation submitted by a participant. Let's use Carol as an example. Carol has been assigned to complete 25 hours a week of work experience since June 4th. She has turned in signed timesheets every week since June 4th, showing that she has completed 25 hours a week. On July 2nd, Carol's case manager conducts the worksite supervisor and follows up on Carol's progress. During the follow-up, the supervisor informs the case manager that Carol has not been to the site since June 8th. What should the case manager do next based on the information she has received? In this example, the case manager would review the participant's case file. A review of the information would include looking at when the participant started the activity. The case manager would take into consideration the discovery date, which could be the best described as the date the case manager found the discrepancy. The case manager might also try to find out who has been signing the timesheets. Since the case manager learned that the customer had not been attending the activity, he or she would need to determine a failure date and mail the notice of failure to the participant. The failure reason cannot be suspected fraud. The case manager would enter a failure reason such as failed to attend worksite and indicate a specific date, not a date range. The failure and the failure date must be specific. The case manager would also make an oral attempt to contact the customer to see if good cause exists for the failure. Once the research of the participant's case has been completed and the case manager suspects fraud, he or she should ensure that the following factors have been thoroughly identified. The time frame of the suspected fraudulent activity must be addressed. Additionally, the case manager will evaluate to see if there's a monetary value associated with this investigation and to be inclusive of the total of all monies and services rendered to the participant during the period. The case manager will prepare available documentation to support the suspected fraud and case note the events in OSST in detail. Copies should be submitted to the local fraud designee in your region, and you should also retain copies of the documentation in the participant's case file. We have created a template for regions to use to make fraud referrals. Program staff will use the template to make the referral for fraud. The form will be provided to the regional designee along with copies of all supporting documentation as stated previously in this presentation. The second page of the fraud referral template allows the individual reporting fraud to select from common support services provided by the WT and SNAP program. The user can also choose a date range using the calendar feature to calculate the amounts associated with each service for suspected fraud date range. The form will calculate the total amount of services received by the participant during the suspected fraudulent period. What happens after we refer a case to the Public Assistance Fraud Unit? Let's take a closer look at this process. After we refer a case in Florida, the case goes to its first stop, which is DCF Benefit Recovery Unit. Although all fraud referrals move on to the next step, this unit is responsible for reviewing the case to see if an evident overpayment has been made. If there is an evident overpayment, not due to fraud, they will start the benefit recovery. Notify the customer that the overpayment has been made and notify them that the department will start recovering the overpayment amount. This is often accomplished by withholding a little bit of their monthly cash or food stamp benefits until the overpayment is recovered. After the recovery unit conducts its review, it goes to the Public Assistance Fraud or PAF unit. This group reviews the case to determine whether or not the case will be referred for a disqualification hearing or the state's attorney's office to prosecute for public assistance fraud. We will discuss more about the determination and how it's made. Disqualification hearings occur when the PAF unit determines an intentional fraud took place, but the amount of the recipient fraudulently received wasn't enough to send to the state's attorney's office for prosecution. To determine if the fraud was intentional or not, the PAF unit will conduct a thorough review to include reviewing documentation collected by the local regional workforce board, interviewing the case manager that made the discovery, interviewing workforce staff. If forgery is involved, they will interview the injured party, employer, instructor, or physician, asking the RWB to provide documentation for events leading up to the discovery, and events that occurred are often required. Intentional program violation, or IPV, consists of 3 levels. Individuals found to have committed an IPV will lose their eligibility of receiving benefits for a specific amount of time based on the number of violations they have committed. If it is the customer's first violation, they may be disqualified from a program for up to 12 months. A second violation carries a disqualification period of 24 months, and a third violation may result in a permanent disqualification from receiving public benefits. A case may be referred to the state's attorney's office for prosecution depending upon the amount of the benefit and services the customers received as a result of the fraudulent activity. The customer may be prosecuted for public assistance fraud at this point. If the case manager suspects fraudulent activity has occurred, they should first make a case note explaining the situation and why the participant is suspected of fraud. Once the case note is complete, the case manager should initiate the pre-penalty if the participant failed to complete a requirement. Next, you will be able to complete the fraud report, gather all documentation that pertains to the suspected fraudulent activity, and make a copy of all materials so you can submit it to your regional designee, and to retain a copy to remain in the participant's case file. Lastly, you will enter a general note in the Florida CLRC screen explaining the events surrounding the suspected fraud. Once the case manager has submitted a copy of the fraud report to the regional fraud designee, the fraud designee will complete the BVBR screen in the Florida system. The designee will print copies of the BVBR screen, one to keep and another copy for the case manager so the information can be stored in the participant case file. Remember, to make a fraud report, you will need some crucial information. You will need the suspected fraud date range, an estimated monetary value for the suspected date range for every service that the participant received during the time period. These services include, but are not limited to, transportation, child care, the cash assistance received during the fraudulent time period, the food assistance, and any other supportive service or local incentive awarded to the customer for participation. After you gathered all the information and suspect fraudulent activity has occurred, you would enter a case note in OSST. The case note in OSST will allow the case manager to record vital information concerning the referral. It is important that you attempt to communicate with the customer to address the failure and counsel them to see if there's good cause. Upon completion of the case note, you would then start the pre-penalty process to complete the fraud referral template. To start the pre-penalty process, you would log into OSST, search for the participant's case, select the Add button under the Sanctions section in the Alternative Plan screen. It is important to note that we do not start the pre-penalty process because we suspect the participant committed fraud. Pre-penalties are put in place because the participant has failed to complete an assignment or activity. You must set a specific failure date for the participant when beginning the pre-penalty process, which would be the most recent date that the participant has failed to participate in the program. You can also refer to the DEO website for a step guide for completing the fraud referral form. The address can be found at the bottom of the screen. It is important to make a copy of all documentation you will be presenting to refer the case for fraud. Place one copy in the participant's case file and provide the additional copy to the regional designee. The final step would be to enter the event notes in the Florida CLRC screen. The case manager is responsible for entering the same information located in OSST case note. Here's an example of the event note included in the CLRC screen. For any additional questions, please contact your local program coordinator. Thank you and have a great day.